Welcome to Rambam. We are doing the laws of tithing, agricultural tithing, and giving 10% of your produce to the Levites after giving first 2% of the produce of your field to the Kohen, to the priest. And we're doing chapter 9 right now. Okay. Let in people. Thank you. Okay, so chapter 9 we're doing today. In the age of Yochanan, the high priest, who served after Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the Just, Shimon the Just was the time of Alexander the Great. Right. This is Alexander the Great, so it's before the Common Era, right? The High Court sent emissaries to search out throughout the entire territory of Israel. They discovered that everyone was careful with regard to the Great Truma and would separate it. Right. The Great Truma, meaning the 2% that went to the Kohen, right? It was holy. And the Kohen the priest had to eat it in holiness, right? But with regard to the first tithe and the second tithe and the tithe for the poor and the common people among Israel would be lax and not separated. They were lax. Why? Because the first tithe was in holiness, and if someone didn't, they would if they did it purposefully, and there was witnesses, they would be liable for excision, early, or passing away at an early age. Something actually we're going to be learning soon. We brought the question about that in Tanya, and we're going to be learning about it in chapter 4, right? But when it came to the other separations, the Jews were unlearned, the majority of them, right? Right. But majority of them were, even though they were unlearned, they did do it. But there was a significant minority that did not. And because of that, so the sages introduced a stringency. Therefore, the sages agreed that only the word of a trustworthy people would be relied upon with regard to tithes. The status of the produce of the common people, by contrast, is doubtful. We do not rely on them if they would say that it was separated tithes. This is called the mai, right? Meaning not certain, it's not 100% because of unlearned people that majority were careful, but others weren't. So they ordained that a person should separate only Trumas Meiser from the Demai. For it was a transgressed punishment by death. But Trumas Meiser, which is what an ordinary person can give, there's 2% you give to the Kohen. And then there is a 1% that is taken from the 10% from the Levite that the regular person could also give it, right? And since there was a greater punishment for it, right? That by death, when it says death here, it means death by the hands of heaven, not by early death. That's what it means, right? And so, since it was punishable by early death, and the second tithe, there is no loss in doing so, since the owner partakes of it. So a person should separate only from the demai. Demai means that which is, right, questionable. So a person should separate Trumas Meiser. And also they weren't worried about the second tithe. So the second tithe is something that you don't lose the benefit. The benefit, though, is not necessarily something, um, it's not necessarily something you'll have but you'll have in Jerusalem. And as you're going to benefit from it by eating it in a state of holiness in Jerusalem, as opposed to giving it away. So there are people, they weren't so concerned. One need not, however, separate the first tithe or the tithe of the poor from the mine because the obligation is doubtful. And whenever one desires to expropriate property from a colleague, the burden of proof is on him. Therefore, he tells the Levite or the poor person, bring proof that it's not tithe, and then take the tithes. Uh-huh. So when it comes to the first tithe, so we're talking about demai over here, right? Something that is questionable. So Trumas Meiser you have to take because it's severe transgression. Second tithe you have to take because it's no loss to the person who's taking them because it's going to be for you, right? But when it comes to the first tithe, the 2% that goes to the Kohen, or the tithe for the poor, from demai. Remember, demai means something that's questionable because it came from unlearned people that were not so careful. So, being that it's doubtful, the burden of proof would be on the person who wants to expropriate or to take it, right? So you can tell the Levite or the poor person, bring proof that it wasn't tithe, and then you can get. Now, even though one does not separate the tithe for the poor before demai, it's necessary to designate it without separating it. So the tithe is not separated for the poor, right? You still have to designate it. So one says a tenth of what is here is a tithe for the poor. This is done to firmly establish the obligation of the second tithe. For the tithe of the poor is given on the third and sixth years instead of the second tithe, which is on the other years of the sabbatical cycle. So you don't have to separate it. You just have to designate it. You're not obliged to give it, as we said, because remember, it's only doubtful. And this is a stringency, a rabbinic stringency. Therefore, and this is only done in order to firmly establish, the second tithe in the third and sixth years, right? Not the other years, because the other years it's second tithe you take to Jerusalem, and then you do need to separate. Right. So just to give the context over here, remember, most people were careful, but there was sufficient amount of unlearned, ignorant people that were not careful with this. And that's why, because it's doubtful, that's what the process over here, what you need to go through. And that would be for the tithe on the third and sixth year. the 7-year cycle. But Trumas Meiser, which is the 1% of the 10% that went to the Kohen, well, actually, I don't think it's the 2%, just the 2%, sorry. And the second tithe are separated from Demai. A blessing is not recited, right? Because there's a doubt here. And when there's a doubt, you don't make a blessing. Because of a doubt, therefore it's permitted to separate it when one is naked, right? Because there's no blessing being made. Okay. How should tithes be separated from Demai? One should set aside an amount equivalent to the measure of a Trumas Meiser, 1/100th of the entire amount. Okay. So yeah, it's the 1%. And place it next to the produce. Say, this tithe is a reminder of the tithes that are adjacent to it. He then says, this portion which I first set aside as a tithe, as Trumas Meiser, for the remainder of the tithes that are adjacent to it. He then takes it and gives it to the Kohen. In order, this order is required because, as an initial prefatory measure, it is forbidden to separate Trumas Meiser before the tithes themselves. Afterwards, you should separate the second tithe. So, first is, we're not worried about, we said already, actually, yeah. Sorry, the 2% that goes to the coin, we're not worried about that. That's done. Everybody was careful of that. But the 1% that came from the 10%, which is 10% of the 10%, which is 1%, right? They weren't so careful. That's what we're talking about. So this is just as a reminder, so we shouldn't forget to do this. Now the order would be, take first the tithes, then take the 10% from it, and then separate the second tithe. Okay. I have to go. I'm going to stop here. Thank you, folks. God bless
Thank you, Rabbi Fine. Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.